You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Welcome back to the Final Say Radio Show. We have Curtis Dubay, who's a senior policy analyst and tax policy expert at the Heritage Foundation, and he's part of the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. Curtis, it's a pleasure to have you back on the program.
Glad to be here.
Well, Curtis, I don't know if I ever shared this with you, but I spent 10 years preparing tax returns, and I still do a handful each year, not necessarily because I want to, because I just feel like I need to keep in touch a little bit. And our tax code, for one, has become just, I guess, outrageous. It's just out of control, outrageous, too complex for even a lot of people, preparers, to manage through the system. I'm sure you remember the quote from Doug Shulman a couple of years back where he said, I could no longer prepare my own tax return because I'm afraid I'm going to make a mistake. I think that pretty much sums it up, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to do a tax return by hand. And fortunately, for those of us for everyone who has to file their tax returns, we have TurboTax. Without TurboTax, I think we'd have a huge groundswell for tax reform because people would be fed up with trying to do their tax returns. But since we do have that software, which is relatively cheap and easy to use, people, it's not too hard to do your tax returns, so we don't have that kind of groundswell for reforming the tax code.
Yeah, but the question is, though, how many people are missing out on opportunities because they're relying on a tax software as opposed to a professional? And how many professionals are missing out on certain aspects of tax law changes because they simply can't keep up?
Yeah, no one. It's funny because and this happens from time to time. But a media institution will bring a fictional family to a tax preparer and say, okay, so tell me how much I owe in tax. They bring it to multiple tax preparers, and they get multiple different answers. There's no right answer because it's impossible to keep up. So we certainly do need reform, and that's one reason. Unfortunately, I don't see tax reform coming in the near future anytime soon. The Senate is controlled by Democrats, and then of course President Obama, and tax reform is about broadening the tax base and lowering tax rates. They don't want to see, and in doing so in a revenue neutral way, they want to see tax rates go up even higher than they've already raised them, and they want it to raise more revenue. That's not tax reform.
Yes, I was going to ask you, because the president had brought up in one of his speeches not too long ago, he suggested that we need to look at our corporate tax laws and make some changes. But I think you're right. I think his intention is to figure out a way to possibly maybe lower rates slightly, but get rid of enough deductions so it's actually a revenue positive change.
Right, and that's what I've said. He's not offering tax reform; he's offering another tax increase. So we have to be very careful when he says this, because basically, so the media runs out and says, "Oh, the president's offering another grand bargain. He's willing to cut corporate taxes, do corporate tax reform, if the Republicans would just give in on spending more on job creation." Well, that's not actually what he proposed. He proposed raising tax on corporations, and he proposed using that money to spend on more infrastructure spending. So he gets everything he wants. He gets higher taxes and more spending on infrastructure. Not much of a grand bargain.
Now, when you look at the polls and what issues are most important for people, economics is at the top. I mean, people are concerned with their finances, but they don't necessarily say taxes are at the top, because I think they don't understand that the two are related. But when we look at our current existing tax system, it seems to me, well, the administration is headed in the wrong direction. But to improve our economy, to improve job creation, to improve the growth of small business and job and everything else that would really help this economy, what changes should we be looking at, and what should the people understand in maybe a more simplistic way?
Well, I mean, I think so. There's lots of stuff going on in the economy right now, and I think one of the major things holding it back is the uncertainty caused by Washington policy. Basically, you have Obamacare, the Dodd-Frank regulations, the refusal to get entitlement spending under control, which is going to lead us to a debt crisis in the not-too-distant future. And, of course, you have the uncertainty caused by the Federal Reserve. You add up all those things, and there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty weighing on businesses and job creators across the country. the president's not going to he's not going to repeal his own health care law. He's not going to repeal his own financial reform regulation. He has shown no interest in getting entitlement spending under control, and he has shown no interest in pushing on the Fed to rein in their easing policies. So if we're not going to get any relief from those four areas of uncertainty, we really need to look to other areas to help spur the economy, and one of those would be tax reform. If we could get tax rates down on working and saving and investing, if we could get tax rates down on capital gains and dividends and on corporate on businesses, we could see some stronger growth. We could see more job creation, benefits that would befall to Americans at all income levels. But again, I'm not very optimistic that's going to happen, because I just don't see the Senate and President Obama going along with tax reform. They don't want to see tax rates lowered.
Curtis, I'm glad you brought that specific issue up, because one of the biggest problems that I have with the current tax code is the level of complexity is so high that it's fundamentally a hindrance to change, right? Meaning there's so many unintended consequences just simply by changing it. And there is a restriction for small businesses to create new jobs. And make no mistake, even most of the large industries we see today, like social media, didn't exist only a few years ago. They start with small companies willing to invest, take risk, and create jobs. And this level of bureaucracy and cost is a huge hindrance. Do you see a risk factor here that by changing, and even if we had a Congress that had the strength and a president that was willing to do so, or a Democratic Party, I should say, that was willing to do so, do you see a huge challenge, because it's already so complex, that going to a simplified tax would actually create in itself a lot of unintended consequences, or is that just a risk we have to be willing to take to get to where we need to be ultimately?
I think the biggest unintended consequences of going to a simplified tax system is that a whole lot of tax preparers and corporate tax lawyers would have to find new callings. And you know what? That's all right. These are pretty highly skilled people. They'll find new jobs. I mean, these corporations they employ an untold number of people to make sure their taxes are done correctly and to make sure their taxes are minimized. And those people could be put to work doing productive things, helping to grow the economy, rather than spending all their time complying with the tax code.
Well, that's a great point. If you're running a company, wouldn't you rather move 10 people from compliance to marketing, or from compliance to sales? Right? That would be a good thing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, these not to rip on these people. They're smart people. They're corporate lawyers. They're highly skilled. It's just that their skills are being used to do something that's not necessary. If we have tax reform, they could be putting it to much more productive uses.
Now let's talk about the true insinuated evil here, though, right? And this is not to disparage individuals for their chosen professions. It's more about a systemic problem. Because of the complexity of the laws, you have so many people whose job it is to manipulate these tax codes to their advantage, and of course use that as a financial wedge to help. Let's say motivate members of Congress to vote in their general direction. And so that's one of the most important reasons for actually simplifying it as well. And I feel we're about to get in the reverse direction. The full implementation of Obamacare, coupled with the complexity of the current tax code, feels to me like a system that we won't get rid of until the entire thing collapses.
Well, hopefully it doesn't come to a collapse, because that would be really bad for families and for workers and for the economy in general. I hope we don't get there. I think over the next couple of years, hopefully we move closer to figuring out how we can have an agreement to reform entitlements, how we can get the tax code under control in a way that we get buy-in from both sides of the aisle. When it comes down to it, we just don't have a lot of agreement from the other side, from liberals. They don't see any problem with entitlements, and they don't see any reason to reform the tax code.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking with Curtis Dubay, who's a tax expert at the Heritage Foundation. And Curtis, I have a question for you, and it's regarding the current polling of Barack Obama, specifically to the economy, which I saw a poll the other day which pegged him roughly around 35%. At what point does the administration have to respond to the general feeling of the public by coming to the table and sitting down with Republicans to come up with some form of compromise to move forward on things that would actually benefit the economy? Or is that just a pipe dream?
I think it's a pipe dream. He's had 5 years now to do that, and if he thought it was in his political interest to do so, he would have done so before his reelection. I don't see him sitting down with them anytime soon. And there's really no trust there. If you recall, go back a few years, the Republicans put together, and the author of the plan was Paul Ryan. They put together a serious reform of Medicare. They left Social Security alone, but they put a serious reform of Medicare. And the president used it as a political cudgel. Basically, he beat them up day in, day out. He did it right in front of Paul Ryan. He had him sitting in the front row of a speech that he was giving, and he attacked him personally by name.
Right.
The president just never established any trust with Congress, and especially with Republicans in the House. And I think that they rightfully feel that if they agreed to go in and start talking to him again and put together a plan, that he would just turn around and use it to beat them up politically. Remember, what the president really wants right now is to win back the House next year. He does that, a lot of his problems go away, and he can go with another wave of very liberal policies. They can push through a lot of stuff in those final 2 years, just like they did in the first 2 years. So that's where his interests lie. And anything that he can use to beat up Republicans, he's going to do that. So I don't see much going on, especially before the next election in 2014. But after that, the president's a lame duck. Who knows at that point? But again, the first 6 years of a presidency are a good indicator of what the end will be like. He's shown no interest to do those hard things. Up to that point, I don't see him coming around at the final stage of his presidency.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you look at the possibility of, say, a Joe Biden or Hillary or anyone else for that matter running for the next term as president, you would think that they would want to at least show that the Democratic Party has the economy thinking about moving in the right direction. But it seems to me that we have so many different issues. If you look at housing's still fragile, but the stock market, you never know what that could do. Interest rates could go up very quickly. Oil, the Middle East could erupt even further, and oil could explode. Student loans, further state and city debt issues. There's so many things that could bring us back down as an economy that you would think that at some point they would have to say, hey, we got to at least cover ourselves here.
I mean that you'd have to talk to somebody on the other side and find out what they're thinking. I can't speak to what's going on in their minds. But the economy is plodding along. It's growing, but slowly and way too slow for this point of recovery. We should be growing at a much stronger rate, at least 3.5%, or at least 3%, but we're below 2%. That rate of growth isn't enough to lower the unemployment rate much below where it is today. Now, the unemployment rate is coming down because more and more people are leaving the workforce, and we have slightly higher job creation than population growth. You add those things together, and you get a slow reduction of the unemployment rate, but the economy is just not growing fast enough to drive it down to where we've become accustomed to it being before the crash, which is around 5%, even below that. So we're not going to see that level of full employment for a long, long time.
Yeah, and I think to make matters worse, you see companies now moving a lot of employees to part-time, approximately the 29 hours, so they can get in compliance with Obamacare, which I think every day we open up the paper and we see another story or two about companies doing this. I think it's only going to continue as we go forward.
Yeah, and it's every day there's a new story coming out about how more and more companies are moving to part-time workers and pulling benefits for those workers already on the payroll. I think that's going to continue. I think that's one reason why the president delayed, probably against the law, delayed the employer mandate in Obamacare. But this is probably going to keep happening. I think one thing on our side, on the conservative side, is that we know the problems with Obamacare and we know that they're severe. But on the other side, they have all their law up and running, and so we can't just assume that just because these problems are existing and the American people are seeing that they're going to they're going to draw back on that issue. They're going to go full speed ahead, and they're going to do everything they can to have that law up and running when they leave office on January 20th, 2017.
So, looking at it from the perspective of a conservative or a Republican who will be running for even the Senate in 2014 or Congress, and then, of course, the next presidential election, shouldn't they be talking up the economy more and running on those issues as opposed to immigration or some of the other issues that just aren't as important with the American people?
Yeah, I think for the foreseeable future, the economy is going to be the chief concern of everyone, because the recovery is much too slow, growth is much too slow, job creation is much too slow. There's some serious structural problems that go well beyond anything that happened because of the financial crisis we experienced in 2008 and 2009. There's some serious problems that we have to deal with, and they're going to require some improvements in government policy and some new policies, and it's going to take a while to right those problems. But yeah, I think it's going to remain in the forefront of Americans' minds, and it would be smart to keep on focusing on how to fix those problems, because I assume the economy will still be weak in 2016, although unemployment will be lower than it is today, and the economy will be growing probably still at 2%, which again will be much too slow. That's assuming that assumes that there's no outside shock. We don't have another crisis. We don't have a foreign crisis. Nothing happens to it. It'll keep plodding along. So it might not be as bad as we think it is. Americans will probably get used to the below average growth, and I think that is a problem in by itself. This is not normal. We should be growing much stronger.
Oh, that's an excellent point, because it's sad to say, but the American people have gotten used to nearly $4 gas. And right now, I actually thought the biggest problem we've had over the last few years is the fact that we have basically, or very close to 0% interest rates. And my biggest fear is that the second those rates start going up, everything else is going to start becoming more difficult.
Yeah, and they'll have to rise at some point. They're not rise. Well, there's been some movement in the 10-year Treasuries here and there, but for the most part, with the easing the Fed is doing, they're keeping rates down, and I think for the time being they're going to keep doing that. But at some point they have to stop the easing, and whether even when they talk about tapering it, the markets tank. But that liquidity is going to have to be withdrawn at some point. Right. When that happens, I don't know. And the problem is no one knows the consequences.
Oh, no, I agree with you that it's got to end. But I think part of the problem is that they did it in the first place, and they've done it for so long, not making other moves to compensate for otherwise within the economy.
Yeah, and they're creating their own uncertainty problem, because no one knows what happens when they withdraw the liquidity they're injecting in, or when they stop adding it, and then what happens when they withdraw it. I mean, the Fed has basically doubled its balance sheet. When it does that,
we're going to find out.
Yeah, but when, no one knows. That's the thing.
That's excellent. Anyway, you can find Curtis Dubay at heritage.org, and anywhere else that you're posting in the articles and things that you work on?
Nope, heritage.org is where they all are.
Okay, great. Well, Curtis Dubay, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to having you back soon.
Sounds good. Anytime.
All right, take it easy. Well, folks, again, that was Curtis Dubay, expert on tax policy over at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks again, Heritage, for all the work that you guys do and all the great experts such as Curtis. And interesting conversation as always.